Hello everyone, we are at the Center for Philosophical Studies of History and we have a very special guest here today in our series Scholars in Conversation. Our guest today is Giuseppina D'Oro from the University of Keele in the United Kingdom. We will be talking about philosophy of history and basically in relation to Collingwood's philosophy. But we will also be covering a few other topics, including the recent rise of the Anthropocene, scholarship, future of philosophy of history, and also metaphilosophy. But now I would like to welcome Giuseppina, or I call you Josie today.
Yes.
And very pleased to have you here. You are going to be 3 weeks. And already this is in the mid of your stay, and this is an excellent opportunity for us to learn a little bit more about Collingwood, about your philosophy, and also a great opportunity for everyone to know more about these very subjects. So
Thank you. Very nice to be here.
I would like to begin with some biographical questions. So you are from the UK at the moment, but you are not really originally from the UK. Where are you from?
I'm Italian.
Okay.
But my whole education was in the UK. So.
The university education?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Why did you want to go to the UK?
I was asked that question once, and because I ended up there by sheer chance, I asked please if I could be asked a different question, which is why I decided to stay rather than why I decided to go. I guess it's because I found the academic environment much freer. I enjoyed the ways in which one could have conversations with your lecturers and discuss them, not as your friends, clearly, because they're a lecturer, but there wasn't the kind of hierarchy academic hierarchy that there is in other countries. So I found the academic environment very stimulating, and so I decided to stay.
Where did you study?
I studied, I did all my studies at Essex, both my undergraduate degree and my PhD.
Okay. I already would like to advance a little bit in this debate. Ask, did you bring Italian philosophy with you to the UK in some form?
Not really. I don't think I quite did that, but maybe that what I brought perhaps is the idea that sometimes it is useful to know about the history of a topic. But I also did quite like the fact that, at least in the UK, certain topics could be discussed without, I suppose, too much baggage. So I brought an awareness of history, but also I relished the fact that that one could study, one could look at a particular idea or study it, if you like, in its own right.
Right. I'm basically referring to Collingwood, and as I understand, there's Italian philosophy of philosophers in the background of Collingwood, like Croce and Gentile and so on. So I thought maybe there's a link for you coming from Italy and interested in Collingwood and there being a background.
Well, not really. I guess that I do feel a little bit guilty about that because I do not bring that background, I suppose, to my approach. In some ways, what made me interested in Collingwood was my engagement with the philosophy of mind as an undergraduate. I got very interested in the philosophy of mind. I thought that it was something that I wanted to know more about. But then, as I studied it, I mean, instinctively, my position was that of being a non-reductivist in the philosophy of mind. But then what I found out is that the kind of non-reductivist positions that were available in the philosophy of mind were very unsatisfactory. So, for example, at the time, not so much now, but at the time, functionalism was hailed as a promising, one of the most promising forms of non-reductivism, and yet it provides a causal theory of the mind. And so, in a way, what I found in Collingwood was somebody who was a non-reductivist, but whose non-reductivism advanced a form of genuine explanatory pluralism. So he was a non-causalist about the mind. So, in a way, what sparked my interest in Collingwood was not so much, I suppose, the Italian connection in that sense, but the contribution that that I thought he could make to certain debates in the philosophy of mind, and the fact that he, that I could see different ways in which non-reductivism could be formulated as a form of genuine explanatory pluralism. So that's, I suppose, has been what has attracted me to Collingwood, the contribution that he actually could make to certain contemporary debates about the nature of philosophical inquiry or about the nature of the mind and the relationship between the human sciences and the natural sciences.
Very interesting. So you work at the University of Keele, and I was going to ask what's your entry point to philosophy of history, but you may have answered it already. Philosophy of mind, perhaps.
Well, the entry point to philosophy of history, again, it happened by chance. I started to read Collingwood's philosophy of history, and I found it quite interesting, but I felt that I didn't quite fully understand it. And then, so I thought that perhaps in order to understand it, I needed to know a little bit more about Collingwood. So I started to look into his metaphilosophy, into his conception of philosophy. So he wrote what are probably two of the most extensive metaphilosophical treatises of the 20th century, An Essay on Philosophical Method and An Essay on Metaphysics, although he tends to be known, I suppose, more for possibly for his philosophy of history. And then I realized that in order to understand what he is doing in the philosophy of history, one actually has to understand what his, more broadly, what his conception of philosophical analysis is. And that unlocks, I suppose, his particular views in the philosophy of history and the kind of distinctive position that he seems to have now, or in certain debates in philosophy of history.
There's, of course, very little philosophy of history at the philosophy departments in the UK as elsewhere, but isn't that right? Do you feel lonely as a philosopher of history?
That's right. So I wasn't formally taught it, and in some ways I still feel that I'm plugging a lot of holes in the philosophy of history because I entered it via the back door, via the Collingwood door, so to speak. Right. So there isn't a lot of discussion of philosophy of history yet.
Okay. Perhaps one more biographical question. I would like to know if you need to list your main areas of focus in philosophy, just for the record.
Sometimes I find it difficult to do that because I'm probably a bit of a generalist. But I suppose if I have to select some, I would say that I am concerned with the relationship between the human and the natural sciences, between humanistic and scientific discourse, and that touches in areas in the philosophy of action and in the philosophy of history. But also I'm interested in, I suppose, in the underpinning conceptions of what it is that philosophy does, what is the role of conceptual analysis in metaphysics, in particular in relationship to Collingwood.
That's indeed a metaphilosophical issue, right? Yeah, good. Okay, let's get ahead now and talk about Collingwood more specifically, and then relation to philosophy of history. Your most recent book is entitled Why Collingwood Matters, A Defense of Humanistic Understanding. And we have been reading the book here, also at the University of Oulu, and I can warmly recommend it. One of the goals might be to understand why Collingwood matters through this conversation. And but let's begin with Collingwood. Who was Collingwood?
Well, he was clearly a British philosopher who was writing at the tail end of the tradition of British idealism. So in some ways he was a little bit unlucky, because he was born historically at the wrong period of time, in the sense that what was happening in the UK was the rise of analytic philosophy. In this respect, the reason why I'm saying that perhaps he was born at the wrong period, in the wrong period of time, is because with the rise of analytic philosophy, he then tended to be dismissed simply because he was an idealist, but also I think his particular form of idealism tended to be identified with, I suppose, more with metaphysical forms of idealism. I think that his idealism is of a different ilk, that although he obviously owes a great deal to Hegel, he is, especially in his mature philosophy, I don't want to say that he goes beyond idealism, but certainly that even he thought that would have some qualifications in accepting that label. So he put forward, I think, a view of philosophy that, although clearly idealist in heritage, also departs in some ways from the tradition of idealism. But as idealism was starting to become old-fashioned and started to be criticized by, the likes of Eyre and so on, Collingwood got lumped in with with, I suppose, the sort of metaphysical idealism that that positivism wanted rid of.
Yes, idealism was, I guess, a big school in the beginning of the 20th century, and even Russell was a little earlier, maybe an idealist, wasn't he? Taken by Hegel, as far as I know. But there were many idealists, and then it started to wane.
Yes, and I think that amongst his idealists, Collingwood is quite distinctive in a way. He is much closer, say, to Oakeshott than the earlier British idealists, because what he did, I suppose, put forward was the view that there are different ways in which we can come to know the world. There are different forms of inquiry. He thought that history was one of them, that natural science is one of those forms of inquiry. But especially in his mature work, he wasn't trying to provide a hierarchy of forms of knowledge. He was more in the business of trying to explicate what the distinctive presuppositions, the assumptions of these forms of knowledge are, but not to argue in support of the primacy or superiority of one form of knowledge over the other.
Yeah, okay. And I also paid attention on another aspect, that he's one of the rare scholars who is both professionally historian, or that is archaeologist, and a philosopher. And we really don't have those many, if any, other, really.
That's right. He was very busy, and it was like a committee of people.
Yeah. And he's well known for his research about British Roman archaeology and history.
Yeah, that's right.
Hadrian Wall,
yes,
all that stuff. That's very interesting. Okay, how about his contribution to philosophy of history? And if we go back to the title of the book, though, why does Collingwood matter? Okay, maybe it's not limited to philosophy of history, but let's begin with philosophy of history and then dive deeper into some notions that Collingwood introduced. So what is his, if you characterize, what is his contribution to philosophy of history?
I would say that he asks some conceptual questions and tries to answer some conceptual question about what does it mean to understand the past historically. And I suppose that these questions are not the questions that have been that philosophers of history have been mostly interested in the sense that probably what has taken the center stage are more epistemological questions about how can the past be known. Whereas I think Collingwood was asking primarily a question about what do we mean when we speak about historical understanding? What does it mean to understand the past historically? And I think, although he doesn't say this explicitly, he thought that that conceptual question about what does it mean to understand the past historically somehow has to be settled first, that conceptual questions are, if you like, I don't want to say more important, but they come first in the order of logical priority. So in order to ask how is it that you come to know something, you've got, first of all, to have a sense of what it is that you're trying to understand. So he was addressing that conceptual question. So what does it mean to understand the past historically? So that when he came to answer the question, I suppose this is to answer your question about what is his contribution to the philosophy of history. What he was saying is that, well, to have a sense of the historical past is to have a sense of the ways in which historical agents looked at the world that is other than the way in which we look at the world now. Although Collingwood didn't use this expression, to my knowledge, he never used the expression, on his approach to understand the past is a little bit like trying to understand another culture. And in order to do that, we have to have a willingness to use, I suppose these are words that Bernard Williams used, to be estranged, I suppose, from our own views, and to see the past from another perspective that is not our own. So just to say, so he was interested in this conceptual question, and I think his view was that to have a sense of the past is to have a sense of how reality is interpreted by agents who live in a very different world from our own. And I think in this respect, his place in the position that he occupies in, I suppose, contemporary debates in the philosophy of history is quite distinctive.
So did he think that we can take distance from our conceptions and reach the other world, the world of the past people, at least it's conceptually possible. But did he believe that it's also, we are able to achieve that we can see the past from the point of view of, I'm asking, is it just a possibility in principle? Is it also a possibility in practice? And if it's not always, what might hinder it? Of course, the cultures and the past cultures can be very different from ours.
So clearly there are added epistemic obstacles in the way of understanding agents who live in the distant past, because we cannot talk to them, we cannot engage in a conversation with them. So that there are epistemic obstacles in the way. However, he thought that it is in principle possible to come to understand them from their point of view, and that in a sense the attempt to come to understand past agents is not very different from the attempt to come to understand contemporaries, our contemporaries, who, however, have very different assumptions from the one which we make. So he thought, he would have thought that if one denies that it is in principle possible to understand agents from the past, then that would actually make it, the logic of that would be that it would also be in principle possible to understand our contemporaries who are making very different assumptions from the ones which we make. So he thought that there are periods of history which are harder to understand, and that historical understanding is not something that we can always achieve in practice. But he, in a way, what he was trying to do is to say, well, let's try and assume actually that it is possible to have historical knowledge. In some sense, he begins in that way. So he doesn't begin skeptically. He begins from, well, let's assume that it is possible. What are the conditions of the possibility for us being able to understand them? And I suppose his answer was that, well, in order to be able to understand them, we have to look at the context in which they live. We have to look at, what the practices were at the time, what the legal norms were at the time, and then we understand them through those things.
Yeah, good. And of course, I guess we have to watch out for our presentist preconceptions that might distort the past.
Yeah.
It's just
me
as a male historian might misunderstand.
So absolutely. So this is the respect in which I suppose he stands out in I suppose contemporary debates in the philosophy of history, because many philosophers tend to be presentist, so they tend to assume that the past is a construction from the point of view of the present. And it's a view that is quite widespread. It's not just found in the philosophy of history, but, for example, it is found in hermeneutics. So Gadamer, for example, is well known for having said that the past is only understood when it is understood in a different way each time. And what he believed is that in order to engage the past, we have to somewhat fuse the conceptual horizon of the historian and that of the agent, and through that fusion, historical understanding arises. But of course, since the conceptual horizon of the interpreter changes as the arrow of time moves on, then the understanding that the fusion of horizon yields changes over time. In some ways, Gadamer, at least Gadamer thought that there was some sort of fusion of horizon. I think in some cases, some philosophers would probably go even, might be even more radical and say that the past is just a projection from the standpoint of the present. And Collingwood resisted that view, and I think he resisted it for many reasons. I suppose one of them is that, if he asks what does it mean to have a sense of the past, well, it is to have a sense of how different things were over there at that time. So that in that respect, the point of historical studies is not to hold a mirror onto the present, but rather to try and get away from the sort of assumptions that we are making and take on the assumptions of the agents. So, and in that respect, I think that he does stand out, because I don't think that, the very fact that what he calls reenactment is possible, that it is possible to understand agents from their own point of view, seems to imply that we're not completely imprisoned in our worldview, into our concepts, that it's not a skin too tight, that that at least it's in principle possible for us to see things from another perspective.
Yes, very good. What struck me when I was reading your book is that I think you identify, from your point of view, several misreadings or misinterpretations of Collingwood. So I'm not going to ask you to summarize all of them, but it seems to me that Collingwood should not be understood as a strong historicist or relativist or reductionist or something like that. Maybe you can say something more. What's the most, what's the biggest sort of mistake or that people have been inserting?
Yeah, I mean, I think that interpretation of Collingwood as an historicist, or let's say an historical relativist, because historicism is one of those terms that has been used in different way, but as a kind of historical relativist, is probably the one that has done most damage. I would say that there are passages in An Essay on Metaphysics and elsewhere which lend themselves to an historicist reading. So, there are passages there where you might think, right, okay, perhaps that's what he is saying. However, when you try to sort of make sense of his work as a whole, then, those passages actually recede in the background, in my view. Maybe there are also some hermeneutic or interpretative choices to be made. I mean, if there are very few. If you think about Kant or Hegel, they've been read in very different ways and sometimes incompatible ways. So I think that what has tended to lead to that historicist interpretation is, I think, probably the fact that his conception of metaphysics as being read through his philosophy of history, but and as a result, he has been seen as wanting to historicize philosophy. But I do not think that that's what he was doing. So when Collingwood says that he thinks that one of the point of engaging in the study of the past is to see it from its own point of view and in its historical context. That is what, in his view, is the point of understanding the past, but he's not really talking about the role of philosophy. So the role of philosophy, in his view, is to understand the presuppositions which govern different form of inquiry, including history. So what the essay on metaphysics would say is that, well, look, if you are trying to understand the past, then you have to adopt certain presuppositions. You have to see the past in its historical context. But that is a claim about how we should engage with the past, and it's not a claim about philosophical claims having being historical claims.
Yes, good. There are many concepts that Collingwood introduced, and people, I think, still know of them. And I thought that maybe we can briefly go through some of them additionally here, very briefly, just for people to understand them better. And I could begin with the quotation from Collingwood, and I think that's an entry point, perhaps. Collingwood writes, "The history of thought, and therefore all history, is the reenactment of past thought in the historian's own mind." So there's the idea of reenactment. If you very briefly just try to explain, what is it?
Yeah, I think that reenactment is one of those terms that probably doesn't help Collingwood. I try actually not to use it too much because I suppose some people start to thinking about reenactment of battles and things like that. And that is quite far from what he had in mind. And there's also this idea that somehow it sort of seems to suggest that reenactment is about rethinking the thoughts that are in the minds of historical agents, or that somehow they're locked in people's minds. And in fact, one of the common criticisms of this view was that first of all, it shows its commitment to a kind of modern conception of the mind as a kind of the Cartesian Lockean view as the mind as an inner theatre, and also that it commits itself to some kind of view that the historians as some kind of hotline to the minds of historical agents, but that is not really what Collingwood meant, I think. So I think what he meant is more something like this. Look, when a historian is trying to understand the significance of something that happened in the past, and it could be an action, but it could also be an event, they have to understand it in the context of thought. So that what is this context of thought? Well, say that Caesar is crossing the Rubicon. Now, the crossing of the Rubicon is perceived as a challenge to the Republic. Why is it perceived as a challenge to the Republic? Well, it is perceived as a challenge of the Republic because the Rubicon marked a border, and because there was a law which forbade Roman generals to cross the border with an army. So when you know all those things, when you know that context, then you understand the significance of that action. So in a similar way, I suppose, just before the war between Ukraine and Russia started, I remember that the Americans were warning the Ukrainians that the Russians were amassing troops along the Ukrainian borders. Ukraine didn't even seem to be very worried at the time. Now, why is it that one would understand that as a potentially dangerous situation? Well, it's not because one is able to enter Putin's mind. Nobody has those kind of telepathic access, but because we know very well that there is a border there, that we know the context in which this is happening, and then we understand its significance. So I think that reenactment really is probably an unhelpful word, and I don't want to say that it shouldn't be used or that, but we shouldn't be guilty, I suppose, of what we shouldn't be clinically literally minded. That's an expression that Williams again uses. Is that if you read Collingwood too literally, then I suppose you create this kind of caricatures of his work. And that is done to reenactment as much as it is done, for example, to his inside-outside distinction. So, when he speaks about what is the subject matter of history, he says that the subject matter of history is action, and that action have an inside as well as an outside. And of course, when he says that, then people say, right, okay, so what does he mean? He means some sort of inner psychological process that is going on in the head of agents, and we really don't want to go there. That it is not helpful, but. That is just a metaphor, and in a way, while the metaphor is potentially misleading, when you read it metaphorically, it can also be helpful in the sense that if you think that there is a different way of understanding the world, which he takes as the way in which history as a form of inquiry understands it, that takes the point of view of the agent, then that is what the inside-outside metaphor is trying to show, but not that that you're actually trying to recover psychological processes, that you're trying to that there was some sort of internal monologue that Caesar was reciting to himself as he was crossing the Rubicon, or that Putin was reciting to himself while he was amassing the troops on the Ukrainian border. So I think that those expressions have to be seen as sort of they have to be read metaphorically, and when they're read metaphorically, I think they can be quite useful.
Yes. Could we think about the reenactment through propositions? At least if propositions, the existence of propositions is very widely, of course, accepted in philosophy, and in particular, if we go to the Frege kind of reasoning, they are ahistorical entities that basically, in principle, everyone can have access to. And then I remember Collingwood writes somewhere about propositions there being a qualitative identity, although not numerical identity. And I have understood this in the following matter roughly, that I can think of the same thoughts as an ancient mathematician, for example, Pythagoras or someone. I can go through the same propositional structure, although of course I can think about, psychologically the same things. Is this correct way to think about it, or?
Yes, I mean, I think he thought that that what historians reenact is thought, and what he meant by that is not the act of thinking, but is the propositional content of thought. So that if you and I are thinking about, we are, I don't know, going through a practical syllogism, I don't know, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore, Socrates is mortal. We are actually thinking the same thought. So the fact that you're standing over there and I'm standing over here, and that you've got your brain, I've got my brain, is that is not what the object of reenactment is. The object of reenactment is just the thought, and in that respect, that thought is distinguished from other thoughts qualitatively, and not in terms of its sort of spatial properties.
Right. Yes, clear. And okay, another notion, scissors and paste history. What does it mean?
Okay. So scissors and paste history. That expression is introduced in the context of his discussion of a certain kind of history, which in some sense is presentist. It approaches the past from the perspective of the present. And when it comes across something that looks a bit dodgy and that cannot be true in the eyes of the historian, then it gets cut. So you come across testimony that talks about people walking on water or stuff like that, and you think, well, that is not true. Then there we cut it out. Yeah. So you paste in what is credible by the idea of the historians, and you cut what lacks credibility. Now, of course, historians have the duty to cross-examine the evidence and ensure that it fits and everything. But the point that Collingwood is he's not saying that historians mustn't be critical, but the point that he's trying to make is that you have to first of all understand the nature of the evidence. You have to understand the context to which it belongs, what it meant, and understanding perhaps the role of miracles or why people believe in miracles is in that respect more important than ascertaining whether it is true that the miracle occurred or didn't occur. So in a way it is a critique of presentism, and I suppose what he would probably think is that the kind of historian that does that approaches the past a little bit more like a scientist that discards, I suppose, past scientific theories that are no longer, that lack predictive power or are no longer useful. So that, for Collingwood, is not the role of the historian. It's not to decide whether, whether we should accept the moral beliefs of past agents or whether we should accept their scientific beliefs. It's more like to understand the role that they played in their forms of life. This is not to say that they cannot be criticized, but that to the extent that there is, insofar as what one is concerned is with understanding, then there's something else that comes first. And I should be careful here. So there is a distinction, I suppose, that should be made between history as an academic discipline and history as in the way in which Collingwood understands it, which is to say, as a kind of form of inquiry. Historians are, of course, quite legitimately can have all their views about these past agents, and they, but the point that Collingwood is trying to make is that there is an activity that has to do with understanding the assumptions, understanding the beliefs, and the role that they play in those agents' forms of lives and practices, and that is what history as a form of inquiry does.
And the distinction between action and event is crucial for Collingwood. Is that right?
Yeah. So his view is that so that distinction is crucial to, I suppose, the distinction between history and science as forms of inquiry. So his view is that there is a kind of reciprocal relationship between method and subject matter, so that the ways in which you approach the world, the presuppositions through which you approach the world, disclose the world, if you like, in a particular way. So if you approach the world through the presuppositions of natural science, what you're approaching the world as an event that is to be understood causally. If you are approaching the world through the presuppositions of history, then you're approaching in a different way. So you are assuming that you are, I suppose, dealing with agents who have a perspective on the world, and you're trying to understand the world through that perspective. So, and when you do that, then you understand it not as an event, but as an action. So if we are studying, for example, if we were going to study the dinosaurs, we're not really interested of the ways in which dinosaurs looked at the world. We're not interested in their civilization. But if we're looking at the Egyptians, a little more recent, but then then we are looking at their worldview, at their beliefs in reincarnation, or in and so on. So that is what the distinction between action and event does. At a very broad level, it explains what the subject matter of natural science is and what the subject matter of history as understood as a humanistic discipline is.
I think the idea of there being presupposition is interesting, and I guess he thinks that there is no presupposition-less knowledge without any presuppositions. And would it be correct to say that it's a bit of a distinction between internal and external questions in a Carnapian sense, that always you need a framework and you can only answer knowledge questions within a framework, or starting from some presuppositions? Or is it going?
Yeah, so the sort of the sort of later Carnap of empiricism, semantics, and ontology. It's that essay. Yeah. So in some ways, what Collingwood thinks is that so he thinks that whenever we are trying to acquire knowledge, we do so because we ask certain questions. So knowledge is the pursuit of answers to the questions that we ask. All questions, he thinks, rest on presuppositions. So, and this applies to the most banal questions. So, if you asked me, why are you wearing jeans? You would be presupposing something, such as that I am wearing jeans. And all questions, no matter how banal they are, according to Collingwood, they rest on some presuppositions. And in fact, without the presuppositions, he would say, the question would not arise. Now, of course, what he's interested in is not this sort of rather mundane presuppositions, but in certain fundamental kind of presuppositions. And these presuppositions, I suppose, determine the kind of questions that are being asked in different domains of inquiry. And they often invoke different conceptions of what it means to explain. So he speaks about different conception of causation, but perhaps the way in which we can put it is by saying that they invoke different conceptions of explanation. So what science is interested in is in explanations which have predictive power, and therefore the kind of method that science has is one that is devised to be able to answer those kind of questions. The kind of presuppositions, on the other hand, which govern history, are presuppositions which require a different kind. He says a different sense of causation or a different kind of explanation. Namely, the kind of explanation that tells you what the point of something is. So just to give you an example, imagine that you were something like a Martian that came on its spaceship and hovered above St. Peter's Square on the day in which a lot of crowds were gathered there and the white smoke came out of a chimney. Now, the kind of, if the Martian were a historian, then they would want to know not what normally happens when there is white smoke coming out of a chimney, but what they would want to know is why is it that the crowds were cheering? What was the point of what was going on there? And historical explanations, according to Collingwood, use a sense of causation or a form of explanation that is aimed at answering a different kind of why question, one where we want to find out the point of what was happening.
The fact that different knowledge inquiries or disciplines, if you like, have different presuppositions entails, I guess, that there is no one supreme way of knowing, or does it? So my question is, does this Collingwood's reasoning lead to pluralism in epistemology?
So definitely. So and above all, he would reject the view that that any of these presuppositions enjoy some sort of ontological primacy, and that is why I suppose his non-reductivism ultimately differs, or rather his explanatory pluralism ultimately differs from the form of non-reductivism that tend to be found within the philosophy of mind, because within the philosophy of mind, what tends to be presupposed is that is a kind of layered model of the sciences in which the explanation of physics have some sort of ontological priority. So there are different sorts of explanations, but only some form of explanations are reflect genuine causal relations. Whereas Collingwood, this is why he speaks about different senses of causations, because in a way he wants to keep the discussion at that, I think, how can I put it, explanatory methodological level. So what he wants to say is that we should look at the different questions that these different kinds of inquiry are trying to answer, and how the methods that they have are geared towards, I suppose, addressing different kinds of curiosity. But what he does deny is that actually it makes any sense to ask the metaphysical question, the traditional metaphysical questions about which of these absolute presuppositions is true of an inquiry-independent reality. So in his view, that question is not just a question that cannot be answered because we are unable to step out of them. It's a question that doesn't make sense. So the role of the philosopher is to find the presuppositions that govern these forms of inquiry, but there is no further, I suppose, metaphysical questions to be asked. So the question for him, if you're asking which presuppositions is absolute presupposition is real, for him that would be the kind of wrong sort of question to ask. Because the right kind of question to ask would be which is fit for purpose in this context, given the sort of thing that you want explained. And he gave an example to illustrate that. He speaks of this guy who is in a car. He drives uphill, and then the car stops, and so he gets off the car. Now he wants to know why. What's wrong with his car and why the car stopped. Then what happens is that somebody goes by, and the person who happens to be a theoretical physicist, and says, oh yes, I'll give you an explanation. The explanation is as to why your car stopped is because the center of the earth is further removed from the top of the hill. And therefore, it takes more power for the car to go uphill. The second person who comes by is a car mechanic and says, "Oh, I know why," and then he comes up with an explanation. You've got a loose wire, or something, Now, Collingwood says it's the wrong question to ask. Who is right? What you have to ask is what is it that you want to find out? Do you want to fix your car? And if you want to fix your car, then the explanation that answers your question is the one of the car mechanic, because the car mechanic has understood that presuppositions that has given rise to your question. And the presupposition that has given rise to your question is a presupposition that it is actually possible for us to intervene in nature and change it, to make intervention in order to change the course of things. So it's a kind of manipulability account of causation. If you didn't think that there is such a thing, then for Collingwood, then you couldn't practice medicine, you couldn't be an engineer, you know, and you couldn't be a car mechanic because it would be a kind of because those presuppositions are constitutive of the sort of practice that you're engaging in.
It does remind me of Carnap again, because and the idea that you need language, you need some language, you need to choose a language, and you choose language according to the purpose. So it's a pragmatic decision, actually, what language you
I think
you
in that
choose.
sense, yes. So I think that it's a decision about what it is that you want to find out,
Exactly. Yeah.
and then what is the kind of explanation that enables you to make, to find the answer.
Yes. Yes. Okay, we've been talking about Collingwood for a while. I want to squeeze in very briefly a few other points about Collingwood, and then maybe we move on to some other matters. So I put two big issues in one question now. Does he have a specific theory of explanation, and does he contribute to the philosophy of causes and causality? Or is it rather better to talk about reasons in the Collingwoodian context?
Okay, so in some ways he belongs to a tradition of within the philosophy of history, where, as you say, the kind of questions that were asked were questions about what is the logical structure of explanation, and is there unity in the sciences? Is there just one form of explanation, or there disunity? Is it the case that history as different as explanations we choose a different logical structure? And in that respect, if you sort of locate it in the so-called reason causes debate, he is somebody who argues for methodological disunity. He would argue that reasons are not causes. That when you say that. He uses a different language, because instead of using the language of the reasons causes debate, he speaks about different senses of causation. But when you say, for example, that to go back to the example of the crowns in St. Peter's Square, if you ask, if you say that they had cause to rejoice at the white smoke, what you are using that term to mean that they had a reason to be happy, that they had a reason to rejoice. And that sense of causation is different from the sense in which the term cause is used when you are saying that, excessive rain caused the river to burst its banks. So there are different senses of causation. That's how he puts it. But it's another way, I suppose, of formulating the claim that although we might be using the same word like cause or because, that it has different meanings. And part of, I suppose, what he saw himself as doing was to disentangle these different forms of explanations. And he used to different senses of causations and different forms of explanations that belong to different kinds of forms of inquiry. And he used, I suppose, to illustrate that point, a nautical analogy. He spoke of, imagine that you are trying to sort of, you've got nets and you're trying to sort of disentangle, because they're a mess. Or I don't know, maybe imagine that you put all your necklaces in a jewelry box and they've all got, they get all tangled. So he thought that trying to disentangle one form of explanation from another and show how actually they are answering different questions is the task of philosophy, except that what you disentangle are certain conceptual knots.
Yes. Another and the final smaller point about Collingwood is or more detailed, is he had a very negative view about psychology, didn't he? Why is that the case? He didn't like psychology in the sense he knew it, whatever it was.
So, I mean, it's not that yes, we have to be careful. That it's not as if he was against psychology, but that he thought that it was a pseudoscience of mind. So he thought that psychology is a natural science. And so the sense in which he was against it is that he was against it is if one tried to pass it as a genuine science of mind. And the reason why he thought it isn't a science of mind is because he thought that, I suppose, the concept of mind, as he put it, is a criteriological concept, so that when we are, I suppose, providing mentalistic explanations, we are using, connecting things through semantic relations. Those are logical relations, they're entailment relations. They are not, I suppose, external causal connections. So, and I suppose that is why, in the end, I thought that Collingwood had something to say about the philosophy of mind, because, in fact, in much contemporary philosophy of mind, psychology is seen. When people try to defend the autonomy of the mental, they are speaking about psychological explanations. But the ways in which they're speaking about psychological explanations is that the psychological explanations, I suppose, invoke beliefs and desires. So they invoke this mentalistic language, but actually the form of the explanation is causal. Whereas what Collingwood is and that's why he's looking at history as what he would be regarding as the genuine science in the sense of form of knowledge of the mind, because it is not an empirical descriptive science.
Yes, thank you. So if we bring Collingwood to this day, and now let's think about philosophy of history or theory of history, what there is around at the moment, would he be critical about narrativism or narrativist philosophy of historiography?
Yes, he would, because he would. In a way. The narrativist turn. So, in some ways, the narrativist turn was also, like Collingwood, concerned in some ways. I don't want to say exclusively, but in some ways, defending the autonomy of history. So, and how it differs from science. And then the answer that was given is that history is different because it provides narratives. And then, of course, many narrativists would say that these narratives are given from the standpoint of the present. And then sometimes narratives have been likened to fiction. And I think that Collingwood would be sort of critical of that, because he would probably think that makes history into a kind of, not proper knowledge or second order citizen. And say, so what he wants to say is that both science and history are forms of knowledge, that they provide explanations of reality. It's just that they have different presuppositions, as opposed to saying, I suppose, that there are that because there are additional epistemic obstacles in the way of knowing the past, that somehow that the study of the past is more problematic than the study of nature. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, it would be critical of the presentism. So I don't think that Collingwood would agree that the past is some kind of that historians construct a past. I don't think that he would agree with that. I don't think in that sense he was a constructivist. So he did think that in some ways that there are different realities. There's the reality as inquired by history, and there's the reality as inquired by science. But I don't think that he would say that historians in that sense construct the past. In some way, they're looking at the ways in which reality has been historically constructed in different ways by historical agents. Mm-hmm.
Yes, thank you. We sometimes have been pondering about the rationale of historiography. So that is basically why to research and write history in the first place. And obviously we can find lots of answers that have been given earlier to run the list through. So it could be argumentation, it could be understanding, it could be narration, it could be mere description, teaching morals, it could be even entertainment or something like that. What would be Collingwoodian answer? Would it be understanding or?
Yeah, his answer would be understanding. But I don't think that, so clearly that would be his answer that, but I don't think that this means that there aren't other things that can be done. I think that there are lots of things that can be done with the past. I think what he would object to is the idea that it is an approach that makes it in principle impossible to have, to see the past from the point of view of the agents. And that makes that sort of historical understanding impossible. So, it's not to say that you can have a practical interest in the past. Of course, you can have sometimes anachronistic histories, have their place. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm speculating here because he didn't say anything about it, but I don't think that he would necessarily say that you cannot do that. But what he would be against is the view that, if you do what he's doing, you've only got an antiquarian interest in the past, that actually, if you understand the past in its own right, that cannot be a guide to the future. I don't think that is true. In some ways, if we want to make relevant comparisons, if we want to learn from history, we've got, first of all, to understand it properly. And if we want the comparison between the present and the past to be apt, then we have to, first of all, understand what went on in the past. So I think he would regard those criticisms that if you look at the past in its own term, then you have only an antiquarian interest in it, as being unfair.
Thank you. Okay, let's move to metaphilosophy briefly. What is metaphilosophy? Can you explain briefly?
Well, yes. I suppose it's the. It answers the question: what is it that philosophy does? And I suppose is that quite a lot of people think that. The task of philosophy, especially the task of metaphysics, is to tell us what really exists. Mm-hmm. It is to tell us what the fundamental structures of reality, or to limn the nature of being, or something like that. And if you do think of philosophy in that way, then there is a sense in which you might say that philosophy has a similar goal to science, except that it tries to do it in a different way. Mm-hmm. And Collingwood didn't think of philosophy in that way. So he didn't think that the task of philosophy is to acquire knowledge of the world. So in a way, he thought that knowledge is acquired in the first order sciences. So if you want to know something about the atomic composition of gold, then you don't ask a philosopher. The philosopher may know insofar as he puts a different hat on. But so if you want to know about history, ask a historian. Yeah. So he thought that knowledge is produced at the first order level. And that what philosophy does is something else, which is to understand the presuppositions that that govern the first order sciences, and also, I suppose, to ensure, is to take a look when certain forms of inquiry attempt to take over. They tend to see of themselves as the only forms of knowledge. So he thought of philosophy in a different way. So he thought that what philosophy does, which is it's not that because that philosophy doesn't give us knowledge that it is useless. It has an important function in both getting us to understand the presuppositions on which thought rests, and also in making sure that we don't talk across purposes when there are concepts which are contested across by different disciplines. And of course, the concept of mind is one of that. It's one concept that, over which both psychology as a natural science and I suppose or neurophysiology and history are trying to say things.
Would it be then correct to say that the job of philosophy is some kind of conceptual analysis or linguistic analysis to straighten out our conceptual obscurities?
Yes, I mean, I guess conceptual analysis, I suppose, means can mean lots of things. In Collingwoods, but yes, so in a way, philosophy does not give us knowledge; it gives us understanding, as in a way in which it is, sometimes, very often, it is put that way. It provides a map of knowledge. It provides a conceptual map. And it clears misunderstanding. So yeah, that's what his philosophy does. So Collingwood doesn't have this view that that the task of philosophy is somehow to find out what the fundamental ingredients of reality are, and to go down to its fundamental components.
Okay. Would that be then? Because I was just thinking that it's not so far from the conception of philosophy held by early analytical philosophers.
No, he doesn't think that. So he doesn't think that. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So therefore. Would it be correct to characterize it as something like descriptive metaphysics? We try to get down to the metaphysical presuppositions.
That's, I suppose, I've used that expression, and clearly Strawson used that expression. It tries to provide a conceptual map of knowledge, and in that sense, that metaphysics is descriptive.
Yeah, but I think what seems to be clear that Collingwood and perhaps you as well oppose scienticism and naturalism. Is that right? Yes. Maybe you have answered it already, but why? What goes wrong if you are a naturalist or even a scientist?
Well, I suppose is that. It becomes impossible to see things and say many things that we do say. if you think that the only perspective is the perspective of science, then there is no such thing as, I suppose, the views that that we express on an everyday level when we explain what people do by showing the point, or all that in a way can no longer be done now. And there is a question as to whether that is even, also what goes wrong there is that in a sense is that in doing that, I suppose, and this is, and I should be very clear, Collingwood is not against science, yeah, so to oppose scientism is not to oppose science in any way. So what he is against is a particular view, it's not science, but I suppose it is a view in the philosophy of science, I suppose, or in metaphilosophy, that refuses to acknowledge that scientific knowledge is presuppositions. And therefore that it is a form of knowing. That is what he would object to.
And I guess one of the debates here in this arena is whether philosophy has a method. And naturalists would say something along the lines that clearly it doesn't. It's continuation of the natural sciences. While others might say that there is a philosophical method. But I don't know if Collingwood has anything to contribute.
Well, I guess he would see philosophy as being discontinuous with natural science, precisely because it's doing something which is of a different nature. It's trying to get behind the presuppositions which actually make scientific knowledge and investigation
But also
possible.
interested in how do we determine the presuppositions other than using conceptual analysis, because it seems to be the case that it's not what there is, because if it's a Collingwood example, I'm not sure that if a murder has happened, we can send a person, we can send the police who investigates, or a pathologist, or if historian gets interested, they will be interested in different set of questions. So that's not what determines, is not what there is, what the being is. The being is the same, or what exists there is the same, but it's rather the approach. So would it be correct to say that it is kind of methodologically driven approach? How do we determine what presuppositions are?
Yes, and certainly the fact that reality can be investigated under different presuppositions doesn't multiply the number of entities that exist, yeah? So that, there is only one car that is explained, was stopping is being explained by the theoretical physicist and by the car mechanic. So the fact that we can bring it under different descriptions doesn't multiply the entities that it just changes the kind of categorical descriptions we bring them under, either as actions or events or
Yes. Good. Then maybe a few words about the Anthropocene and the post-humanistic approaches. And both of these have been very popular recently. But maybe I begin with another, maybe related idea. Well, that's the idea of they being historical sciences, the category historical sciences, which covers all the kinds of historical sciences, such as archaeology or philology or paleontology and evolutionary biology, perhaps even cosmology, which can be perceived as an historical science as well. And therefore, I think it evaporates any distinction between human understanding and natural understanding or non-human understanding. We can presume that.
So I guess that for Collingwood, the past is a kind of ambiguous term. Just as the term of cause can mean different things, the term past is an ambiguous term in the sense that it can be the past as it is understood by a paleontologist who is interested in tracing the evolution of a particular species through its fossilized remains. The past is studied by different. It can be studied in different ways. So Collingwood wouldn't want to say that only historians study the past, or only historians in the sense of in which he means it. But he does want to say that there is a distinction between the natural and the historical past. Mm-hmm. So that if you are carbon dating fossilized remains, that's the study of the natural past. It is also the study of the natural past if those fossilized remains happen to be that of a king buried under a car park. Now, clearly those findings are very useful to historians who are asking different kind of questions about why is it that that particular king was killed and buried where he was, but nonetheless they're different kind of questions. So I think that that some of the disciplines that you have mentioned for him would be natural sciences, so they wouldn't be history, in a very specific sense of history as a form of inquiry, But that doesn't mean, of course, he would say there is an evolutionary history. So, but when you say there is an evolutionary history, then you, in a sense, you're using the term history in a different way from when you are speaking about the history of the Egyptian civilization. So, I don't think that he would have said, look, you can only reserve the term history for humanistic, for a form of knowledge which is humanistic in character. But nonetheless, he would have said that there is a maybe a narrower sense of history, which or a distinctive sense of history that refers to that has those humanistic concerns. And what he would want to do is to make sure that we differentiate between the two. He wouldn't necessarily want to say that they have to be compartmentalized, that they cannot cross-fertilize, but nonetheless they would say, but they are asking and answering different kinds of questions.
Yeah.
So I've used one example once, which is like, you can think of the ways in which in the detection of crimes, forensics has become very, very important. So police detectives are really helped by forensic examinations. But the forensic scientist is sort of, they're interested in the chemical compositions of the grit that are found under the victim's fingernails. Yet they're not asking the question, who had reason to kill this person, and of course, knowing, that knowing the results of the forensics is very useful to the detective, but ultimately the questions are different. And that is what he's trying to do, is to try to show that there are distinctive complexes of question and answers that belong to different ways of understanding the world.
Right. I have the feeling that you may have answered already why Collingwood wouldn't accept the sort of Anthropocene approach to history, that all histories are covered in one period, maybe through one approach. But it seems that they really don't respect many of the distinctions that Collingwood would like to have, nature and culture distinction, for example. But if still more specifically, if you would like to add something, since I think you criticized Chakrabarty and Latour and maybe others. So is there something to add? What goes wrong with the Anthropocene?
Well, as I said, I think that that the collaborations of discipline is very important, but sometimes what is being done in some of the literature that is coming out of the Anthropocene is is that some people want to say that that because somehow, in order to face the challenges of the future of climate change and so on, we have to understand human history or the historical past in the context of the natural past, because if we didn't do that, for example, then we may not have been able to make the connection between the fact that after Columbus' discovery of America, there was a high mortality, and that led to the so-called Little Ice Age. So those connections, about the way in which we contribute to the warming of the planet, cannot be understood unless, I suppose, these natural histories and cultural histories intertwine. And that's fine. But I think that some people want to go beyond that, and they want to undo the distinctions between nature and culture, or the historical and the natural past. And I do not think that that is very useful. And it is not very useful because ultimately, it is only if there is an historical past that there can also be an historical future. So, if there isn't an historical future, then the future can just be predicted in the way in which you will predict the weather, the storms, and so on and so forth. But so in a way, it sort of undermines the possibility of historical agents and the possibility of change that is politically driven.
Right, and that has bad political implications as well. Undesired political implications. Yes. Okay, thank you. I guess we could move to the last section now, and that's we'll be discussing about future of philosophy of history. Where do you see this philosophy of history going now?
Well, it's the $1 million question. Yeah. I don't know whether I've got something very intelligent to say. Obviously, philosophy of history is not being taught much in philosophy departments, certainly not in the UK. One could diagnose the reasons as to why that is the case. One reason might be that perhaps there is a lot of talk about time, but normally it's talk about the metaphysics of time. So, is time ever present? Is it a growing block? Or, so in a way, people are concerned with time, but they are concerned with time from, I suppose, more like from sort of heavy-duty metaphysical point of view. They're not concerned with, I suppose, the concept of the historical past in the sense in which this discussion, or with presentism in the ways in which that is being discussed in the philosophy of history, where it is, I suppose, an epistemological claim. In some ways, it could be that one of the reasons why philosophy of history is not quite so central is because a lot of these sort of methodological questions are not sort of being investigated or so central maybe. But then you could say that perhaps that could be the case with the philosophy of science, and the philosophy of science is not suffering in the same way. I think that one problem is that probably there are very few mainstream philosophers that have engaged with the philosophy of history. Perhaps Bernard William is one of them, but is one of of the very, I suppose, few exceptions. So I don't know. I think that in some ways the problem is an institutional one, because once you it's a little bit like once you destroy something, is very difficult to reconstruct it and to go back. So if you don't have people who teach the philosophy of history, then you don't have the students, and then if there aren't, I think that what you're doing here is very important, because in a way you're creating opportunity for people to come and be research fellows, or to do PhDs. But I remember somebody saying to me once, "Oh my goodness, I'm concerned that if I've done my PhD on Collingwood, I may never get a job." And that's that is the worry, is that how do you get back? Because there was a time, I suppose, when
there was a time, after the war.
Yeah, when this concern,
Gangl and many others who were employed by departments of philosophy.
Yeah. So how you do that, how you get back, is that's, I suppose, the question that is.
Seems right to me that is more institutional question. Of course, you could start with turning into a more paradigmatic discipline, but I'm not sure if it helps in the end of the day. And then, more rigorous conceptual problems and approaches and so on and so forth. But I'm not sure if that takes it to philosophy departments, unless you directly engage with philosophy of time or philosophy of action, maybe.
But it seems to me that in any area of philosophy, whatever that is, ultimately you've got epistemological questions, you've got metaphysical questions, you've got conceptual questions, and I don't see why the philosophy of history should be an exception in that sense.
Do you think it's important to distinguish between philosophy of history and theory of history? They are sometimes taken as synonymous, and sometimes people wish to make a difference. I'm not sure. Let 1,000 flowers bloom. Okay, good. Okay, thanks a lot. What are you currently working on? What is your...
thanks to you, really, I have been looking into what seems to be a kind of realist backlash against the sort of constructivism that has governed the philosophy of history, and the suggested solution that in order to do justice to some views that seem to be reasonably sensible, like the view that the past doesn't change, or the present doesn't change the past, or that that it is possible to have historical knowledge and so on, one has to be a realist. And I guess I'm trying to say that while those concerns are important, they have to be taken very seriously. And actually, I agree with those concerns. Perhaps there are ways of do justice to those views from a different standpoint.
Very good. Looking forward to hearing and seeing those results in due course. Is there anything that we have forgotten? Anything you would like to bring up?
No.
No, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Georgie. And this has been very interesting, and I genuinely have learned a lot about Collingwood and other matters. And thanks so much. We'll continue this series in the future, and there will be another program coming. I don't know exactly when, but thanks for watching.